There's a common criticism going around trying to diagnose why Hollywood has been losing money in recent years, simply saying, oh, if Hollywood would just make good movies, we would go to see them. And don't get me wrong, quality, or lack thereof in a movie, can, and evidently has been, a contributing factor to whether or not a film succeeds or fails in its second or third weekend. But as far as a film that underperforms in the front load of its first weekend goes, there will be just as many people that will declare that Hollywood has been making good movies for years, and that people have simply not gone to see them. Every year there will be at least one movie that everyone will say, you morons, that movie was so good and you skipped out on it, and now all we get is garbage this and garbage that. For a lot of people, myself included, two of those films included Furiosa and The Fall Guy, two well-crafted films that made excellent use of practical effects with great performances across the board, well-paced plots, and well-developed characters and stories. Both films were clearly made with a passion for their stories and were no doubt the fully realized visions that each director had in mind, and I, and just about everyone I've talked with about these films, have given their exceptional thumbs up to them and told others that they should check them out. And yet, as evidenced by Furiosa being the reigning champion of the worst Memorial Day weekend in 30 years, and The Fall Guy barely matching its box office to its production budget before getting dumped onto digital, that didn't turn the tables for anyone. I mean, people called Furiosa a masterpiece. People said they were dazzled by the practical stunts in The Fall Guy over the CG nonsense in something like The Marvels. I myself gave the thumbs up to both films, and I mean, what else could any of us have done? Part of the problem, which may not sound like a problem at first, but hear me out, is that both are actually perfect examples of how Hollywood has gotten consistently better at making films of quality in general, with indubitably polished and competent craftsmanship and some impressive budgets, ones that a lot of us didn't expect behind these types of projects. In general, Hollywood has gotten better at getting talent behind the camera, for the most part, sticking to its expert craft, for the most part, and not succumbing to annoyingly cheap and pandering marketing gimmicks, for the most part, at least with their theatrical releases. Streaming still gets streamlined with its slew of garbage, to the point where the services themselves are too ashamed of them to really push them in advertising, with the exception of Disney releases that seem to have hinged lately on the brand without concern for quality, and suffered for it. Hollywood studios have gotten consistently better about making sure that their theatrical releases have a stamp of quality before heading out for distribution. They've in fact gotten so good at this that simply being considered good, at least by that definition, has started to lose its competitive edge, which in this day and age is desperately needed now more than ever, particularly ever since the pandemics that we're still trying to recover from. Most people that I know generally only go to the movies maybe 5 or 6 times a year, and as others have pointed out in the past, there are far too many, oh my gosh, this movie is so good, you have to see this right now, movies coming out for everyone in the 4 quadrants, male, female, over and under 35, to keep up with. Services like AMC A-List or Regal Unlimited can help out with that to a certain extent, but even that gets pretty pricey for these families of bare minimum 4, especially when the real money for theaters is in the jacked up candy stand. Combine that with factors like inflation in general and studios continuing to thin the windows for their movies to be available on digital despite clearly making more of a profit with the successful box office, morons, and the average party has an onslaught of compelling reasons not to go to the theaters up against studios and audiences' only argument for going to see these movies in theaters being, it's good. As much as we don't like to admit it, okay cool, I'll catch it when it comes out on streaming, does sound more like a natural response to it's good when you take that into account. Don't get me wrong, I'm a huge contender for the theater experience. I mean, I only run an entire short series off that concept, but most people aren't, at least not for every good movie out there, and it's really not that hard to see why. With that said, what does draw audiences in when they do go? What allows something like the Super Mario Bros. Movie or Godzilla x Kong to take the world by storm, even when there's so many arguments against the idea of leaving your home, buying $50 worth of snacks, and sitting in a room full of smelly people that won't shut up and look at the screen rather than not shutting up and looking at their screen? Well, to put it simply, when a movie like the Mario movie does come around, many audiences convince themselves that it's worth enduring all of that, and part of what convinces people to do that is that audiences feel like the films they pay to see are practically tailor-made for them. While critics weren't terribly fond of the Mario movie, for instance, every gamer of every generation felt like they were finally seeing the movie they always wanted to see since the first time they picked up the controller for the game, as everything from the beautiful animation to the breathtaking score to the super well-integrated references that everyone could recognize was a dazzling sight that everyone had to experience on the big screen and pay that expensive candy stand prices to make into a breathtaking experience. Because let's face it, that popcorn sounds pretty nifty when you're paying to see this. Part of the contribution is that the studio listened to the complaints against the live-action garbage we got in the 90s, as well as a slew of indisputably bad video game movies we got over the years, and delivered an amazing experience for audiences along with developing the film they've always wanted to see. And that went alongside Miyamoto and the rest of Nintendo working with Illumination to bring their vision to life. But if that had been the only contributing factor, chances are the film wouldn't have turned that much of a profit. They had a read on their audience, and audiences knew that and paid to see their fully realized vision because, in a way, it was also our fully realized vision. Other big hits like Godzilla x Kong, Kung Fu Fu Panda 4 and Barbie took a similar approach of both listening to the criticisms of the past, if any, and first and foremost, catering to their audiences on top of making films well crafted and of quality, instead of only doing the latter like so many other films that Hollywood propels on us have done. And I know that sounds backwards saying they only made films of quality, but quality means nothing without value, and these films have much more value to audiences than these films because the studios took into account what we would find valuable. No matter what genre, franchise, or series you look at, Rotten Tomatoes score be damned, any film that has managed to turn a profit has in some way, shape, or form read their audience like a book and made the films for them above anything or anybody else. And don't get me wrong, an artist getting to be an artist is just as much my preference as yours over the studio simply being the studio, but at the same time, if these studios want to turn a profit from these investments they make, the first step towards any successful business venture is knowing your target audience and knowing what they pay to see and why they pay to see it. And as backwards as it may sound considering how much the internet likes to tear into studios for playing things too safe or being too pandering, the opposite detriment can take just as much of an effect when you let your artists lean too heavily into their expert craft without bearing a potential audience in mind. There needs to be a balance. Furiosa and The Fall Guy are expertly crafted films, but they were clearly not made with a target audience in mind. Furiosa, even taking into account the extremely niche audience that made Fury Road a modest hit 9 years ago, was not the first tale that anybody would have suggested, let alone demanded, coming out of Fury Road. Anybody coming out of that would have instantly demanded a sequel to the film with Tom Hardy and everything. But instead, if I had to guess, George Miller instead wanted to tell this tale more than anything else, and the studio most likely trusted audiences to love his craft so much from Fury Road that they would have come out to see that just as much. No dice, amigo. Fall Guy, I'm sure everyone is convinced by this point, was most likely made less as a business venture to draw general audiences in, but instead more as a loving tribute and heartfelt apology to the underappreciated stuntmen that go through a ton of shit in their career. And don't get me wrong, they do go through it, and they deserve a tribute, but do you really need to invest this much money into a mere apology without really having that proven audience in mind to make that money back? Was the tribute at the Oscars not going to cut it for them? I mean, the film did take a rom-com angle, but even rom-coms don't make that much money. Hell, we just have a bunch of free ones on the Hallmark Channel. Both films were made as the films the filmmakers wanted to see without taking into account any audiences that would pay to see them and investing way more into it than they were ever likely to make back. And don't get me wrong, there's absolutely nothing wrong with artists making the works of art they want to make. I mean, we've seen the kind of garbage that Hollywood can make when they act like they know for sure what audiences want when they obviously don't. But especially with the insane amounts of money Hollywood invests in these films, look at you, Apple! They've also let artists lean too far into their own side of the spectrum when they really didn't have a proper read on any potential audiences, a key trick that many filmmakers trying to be Chris Nolan didn't seem to know that Chris Nolan had perfected, or understood what audiences would want to see in conjunction with their visions for their project. They seemingly only took into account the emotions that they would want to get out of the film on display without having the connection with audiences that would have given them a better feel for the emotions they could get out of the film they pay to see. It's great that you got your vision to life, it's great that you had a lot of financial backing to your vision, but if you never ask the question, why should these 4 quadrants of audiences pay to see this, then how are you expecting to make that much money back? Hell, even films without the 4-quadrant level budget struggle with this. I'm not saying that good craftsmanship or a passion for your project shouldn't be a part of the equation. Like I said earlier, word of mouth has both saved potential flops and devastated what looked like gigantic hits in the past, but that can't be the only factor anymore, if it ever was, but especially not now. We have plenty of good, well-crafted movies to watch at home with the explosion of digital, and as much as you yourself may like the projects you make, you need to know just as much in your heart that the audiences you're distributing to these films will love it and race out to it as well, or else, to put it simply, they won't, good or not. Good craftsmanship and a passion for your project is only going to get you so far, especially when that good craft has saturated the market and flooded the TVs at our home. You have to make your movie just as much with audiences in mind, or else it won't hold any value to them and basically just be background noise to them. Like, ugh, they're playing that trailer again? Give it a rest, would you? While there are a lot of external factors working against theaters that John Campea actually went over pretty passionately and effectively yesterday, see the link up here, internally, we also need more movies out there that get audiences excited to go to the movies again. And that starts with making films with target audiences in mind from filmmakers that can connect with audiences and not just make something well crafted that they have this brilliant vision for. Not that a filmmaker having their vision fully realized isn't important, but it needs to be balanced with the read and understanding of your audience, or else you're basically just making the film for yourself. And unless you have $140 million in your pocket to give back to the studio, that ain't gonna cut it for them. I understand better than anybody how hard it can be to get a read on audiences, but that doesn't make it any less of an essential skill in the business. You have to start making films for the level of audiences you invest in, because if you're not going to make the film for us, why should we pay to see it? Because it's a good movie. No.